Hi, friends. Kristen here, letting you know that you're in for a real treat on today's Encore episode with Frank Velásquez Jr. This episode originally aired the day after the election, and we want to make sure it gets its proper due. Brilliant on its own, this episode is also a great warm-up for the Elevate Conference, School for Your Fundraising event, where Frank will be joining us live to talk about how using asset-based language can revolutionize giving. He'll also be on hand at the event to answer your questions. So listen to Frank's insights today, and then join us at Elevate on March 12th and 13th. This hybrid conference makes it easy to attend in person in Portland, Oregon, or online from anywhere. Check out details and get tickets today at swaimstrategies.com. Now sit back and enjoy Frank Velásquez Jr.
Welcome to the Fundraising Elevator, where we're all headed up. This podcast is a production of Elevate, an online learning platform for fundraising event professionals. We're coming to you today from the studios of the AV department. Please welcome our hosts, Kristen Steele and Samantha Swaim.
Hello, welcome to the Fundraising Elevator, where we're all headed up. We have an announcement to kick off our episode today that it is the last chance for early bird. If you have not registered yet for the Elevate conference and you are looking to take your fundraising event to school, be sure to register. Early bird expires in just 2 days on November 8th. This 2-day hybrid event will dive deep into everything you need to increase your fundraising at your next event. We're teaching you how to secure more sponsors, craft a compelling program, and hit a home run for your fundraising. Early bird tickets are until November 8th, so grab them now. Additionally, we want to make sure you know about the Nonprofit Storytelling Conference coming up in New Mexico in just a few days, where you can see Kristen, myself, and our special guest today. So we hope to see you there. And we hope everyone took the time to get out and vote yesterday. And as we dive into today's conversation, we feel like it's really important that we think about language choice. We can uplift and celebrate the communities that we're working with. We can remove barriers. And so we have invited an expert to the table today to join us in the elevator.
I'm going to formally introduce him. For those who don't already know and love him, please meet Frank Velásquez Jr., storyteller extraordinaire, social justice warrior, and community connector. With a heart as big as his vision, Frank dances on the front lines of change, armed with an unshakable belief in racial and gender equity. Whether he's dropping knowledge on the conference stage or storytelling behind the scenes, Frank's passion for social justice is as infectious as his smile. And he creatively connects our stories, preserving the unique flavor of each, like a delicious bowl of gumbo. As founder of For the Hood and the mastermind behind the Ascending Leaders of Color Leadership Program, he's forging paths for peeps of color to leave with authenticity, courage, and joy. Because for Frank, advancing equity isn't just a job, it's a movement towards building generational wealth for communities of color to thrive. Frank, you're awesome.
Yes.
Thank you for giving us your time today and for being here to chat.
Thanks for having me. This is exciting.
So let's kick it off. Can you explain what deficit-framed language is and the damage it can do to organizations who continue using it?
Absolutely. So deficit frame language, really it's a narrative that focuses on the negative aspects of a situation or an experience rather than focusing on the strengths. Some great examples might be, like using at-risk youth, or struggling reader. So as you can hear in those two situations, at risk, that's a deficit. That's a negative experience. I often think about, like, even with Native Americans, stories that we were told growing up were that these were savages and that folks came across the Atlantic and tamed it, but there were thriving communities prior to the arrival of those three boats. So that's how I see it. And then I love how you asked, and the damage that this language can do to organizations who continue using it. I might frame it a little bit differently, saying, well, the damage is really done to the people, to the community.
Yeah.
And so as those words are reinforced over generations, the harm is happening to them. And I would now, to answer your question, though, the damage it does to organizations is, I feel like there's been a movement around since 2020 of really focusing on community-centric fundraising practices. And so organizations that continue to go down the path of harm, that's the damage that can be done. I feel like if they're not up If they're not keeping up with these changes that are happening in our sector, that's the damage that can happen with those organizations.
I love that. I mean, I don't love that clearly, but that we're talking about
Yeah.
it, and then we're taking a look at how we're speaking about things, because I think also the damage is that inadvertently sometimes we're working against our mission,
Yeah.
just simply by how we're framing what it is we're trying to do.
Absolutely.
I'm wondering,
Absolutely.
Frank, could you flip those two examples into a different frame? So instead of at-risk youth.
Oh yeah. So first of all, and I didn't say this earlier, but the alternative approach to the language is asset-based language. So often, yes, we've heard at-risk youth, and what our brain does is we become socially conditioned to hear certain words, and then we conjure up certain images because we've heard these words over time. So an alternative to at-risk youth might be something as simple as students who are in historically under-resourced regions, or you could say high opportunity youth, which is what Goodwill Industries uses as they describe that population. The second one, what was the second
Struggling
example?
reader.
Oh, struggling reader is like just, again, maybe a student who's in a low socioeconomic area, something like that. So what it does is it removes the negative connotation and that puts it on the person,
Yep.
and instead puts it on the region, puts it on the circumstances that they're in. It focuses on the systemic challenges or disparities that again have shown up throughout the history of America. So that's how you can flip those two.
Yeah.
Well, I think if you are looking historically at the nonprofit sector, well, not even historically, let's look right now. The nonprofit sector, in the word alone, nonprofit, we're starting with a deficit frame, right? Nonprofit, instead of thinking about our businesses as for community, for impact, for
Social impact,
enterprise.
yeah.
Sort of big picture, where do you feel like we could be doing better in this sector?
I think the biggest first step in pretty much anything that's been harmful is to acknowledge it. And so when you hear organizations beginning to acknowledge the harm that they've done, and whether it's through a statement and then ultimately through actions, that is a very big first step. Because as I mentioned a second ago, we tend to blame, even if we're not outwardly blaming, the words that we use tend to blame the clients for their situation versus, as I mentioned, the systemic disparities that were always present that kept certain groups down. And we can go again throughout history,
Yeah.
Native Americans, the genocide of them, slavery, internment camps. So you could keep going on and on and on and really describing how this has shown up throughout our history.
Yeah. The way that organizations frame their story and the language they use, we've been talking about, are often some of the biggest pieces to moving mission forward. And I think one is awareness of that, even as something that needs to be addressed or they need to think of. And then we're all in nonprofits. We know all the layers that happen, and sort of the move toward change sometimes is more incremental than we'd like. Sometimes there's a lot of having to move stakeholders forward. So for somebody sitting in the center of that who's clear, like, yes, I get that we use this language and we're telling stories that are actually not naming the barriers and what we're doing to eliminate the barriers, but are actually putting the barriers on the people.
Right.
And continuing them to suffer to those barriers. Where can folks even start? Because I think sometimes with big change, there's this paralyzation that happens just even at understanding, like, where do I start to impact this?
Such a great question. I think one of the biggest fears I hear a lot from fundraisers is, they're afraid that the donor is not going to give if they frame it in an asset-based way. And my response to that is, if it continues to do harm, then you have to reconsider, or just re-educate, or educate our donors further. So where to start, I think, is probably there. I'm not going to name the person, but a couple of years ago, this is a major fundraiser. We had a conversation, and they said, Frank, the donor-centric model works. There's money coming in. I don't know too much about the community-centered model, and until I see different, I'm going to continue down this path. And it was so disheartening because um, my response back would be, yeah, maybe these organizations are getting money, but does poverty still persist? Do these issues still
Mhm.
continue? And they do.
Yeah.
And so any short-term gain of money, you know, to me is not worth it if you're continuing to do harm in regards to how we describe people, how we talk about people. I can even go as deep as a personal one for me where I said something, or I was taught all of these donor-centric practices focused on a client's tougher parts of her life, and we did not get her permission, her consent, or even though we said we would, in regards to her reading the final draft. She got a hold of it after we did this, and mind you, I had thought we had gotten her consent. It doesn't matter at that point. I'm leading the organization, and she was furious. And you're like, you just focused all on my bad things of my life.
Mhm.
You didn't talk about what I'm doing now. You didn't say anything positive
Mm.
about where my life is going. You just focused on that. And so again, similarly, if organizations, I'm reading the question again, where can they even start? It's just ensuring that they don't do harm. Just get clients' consents if they use stories of clients, um, and really have that deeper understanding of, is this for the good, versus it's just for getting money to continue the organization. Because if you're perpetuating harmful stereotypes, it's not working, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Well, and I think that sometimes that donor-centered approach is actually extractive, right, from the folks
Right.
that we're supposed to be in community with and the folks that
Mhm.
we're partnering with to move all of us forward. And so I think the replication of the systems of oppression, people get really defensive around that.
Mhm.
They do. They
Like,
do.
you know, that's a hard thing to hear.
Yeah.
It's an even harder thing to sit with and either make amends for or choose a different path forward.
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of people step back because they're like, I don't want to have that conversation with a major donor. I
Yeah,
don't want to
yeah.
have, you know, and so I think this is a long-term trajectory of justice. This
Right.
isn't just, I've got to get
Yeah.
10K more in the can so that I can get everybody off my back for my fundraising budget this year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What I often say, Kristen, and I appreciate you saying that, because what I often say is that I would never advocate for any fundraiser to hit somebody over with a hammer. It's like,
Mhm.
you know, your donors, the ones that you feel are going to be approachable, would sit and listen with it,
Mhm.
then hit them with the hammer. If
Yeah.
it's those who might be a little bit resistant, um, chip away. That's my favorite phrase. Just chip away. You know, I've had those experiences where I've had to have these crucial conversations with donors, with one particularly with the organization I led, and it resulted in a really positive experience. I needed to help her reframe how she viewed the students that we supported. And so yeah, you chip away at the ones that are going to be a little bit harder, but the ones that are ready, have that conversation.
Well, and that's, I think, in the end, that's why dominant cultures are dominant cultures,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
They're not asked to seed space or
Mm.
to pull in multiple perspectives sometimes, and that's the work.
Well, and I would advocate
Absolutely.
too that language evolves and
Yeah.
changes. And so I think that there is always, I mean, I think the good donor is the donor that wants to lean into the space and say, help me understand and teach me. But obviously, not every donor is there. But as we start to understand language and language evolves and changes, I mean, we have terms now in culture that we didn't have language for 10 years ago, even.
Oh yeah.
And so I think that, to your point, Frank, when you were in leadership of an organization and you started to have these conversations, what is the like evolution that can happen within the organization when they start to do this asset-based work? How does this impact the organization?
From a leadership standpoint, it can impact it greatly, like in a positive way. So the minute I started to shift, and mind you, one of my own staff was the one that shared with me and said, Frank, our students don't like to be described the
Hmm.
way that we're describing them, or that you're planning to describe them. And that hit me hard because again, these were things that I had learned and I was like, oh my God, you're right. And so I think the evolution of language, or certainly starting at a point where that language shifts, it automatically shifts how people hear it. And I think that's the most important thing. If I say it differently, people are picking up on it. If I lead with saying, hey, the South side of Tucson is one of the most beautiful regions in Tucson. It's got music, they've got food, they've got dance, it is so vibrant. And it's also one of the most historically under-resourced regions in our community. I'm leading with what is beautiful about
Yeah.
it. And then I can say, and there's challenges here. So to me, that's a great way of kind of always ensuring that we're talking and we're uplifting. We can still talk about the issue and the problem, but the thing is we should be leading with the aspirations and strengths of the community versus saying, oh, here's this poor community and here's everything that's bad. Because again, our brain um, searches for biases, and
Yeah.
it's a way of protecting ourselves.
Right.
So when we lead with that, we're only reinforcing it. So disrupting those brain patterns is just simply flipping what I just said. Lead with the aspirations, and then you can talk about the issues in the community.
It reminds me of an organization that we were working with several years ago where they served a student population that was at the time defined as at risk and homeless. And the students came and said, this is not how we want to be defined. That is happening to us. That is not a choice we're making. And that's not who we are. That is happening
Right.
to us. And so the students got involved in actually being a part of the conversation about how do we define and bring people into the conversation about who you are. And beautiful language came out of that conversation. Like, I'm an artist, I'm aspiring, I'm on the edge because I've been pushed out by society, but I have dreams, I have aspirations. That sort of shift was a powerful engagement with the client base and the community and service, but also then created a really cool narrative to be able to share with donors and bring donors along, so that
Right.
the language evolution was something that could kind of be both a revolution within the organization, but also a education moment for donors.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I know we're going to talk about this in a bit, but for sure, when I hear you say how those donors are now receiving that message, I mean, who wouldn't want to give from a place of support versus a place
Right.
of pity when you hear those
Yeah.
stories?
Yeah.
And again, historically, we talk because, oh, those poor kids, let me give them money, versus what you just described. Students saying, no, these are my dreams. And that's where, and again, I know we'll talk about it in a bit, but that's where the transformation happens, where donors are really feeling what that community that they're a part of really looks like and what they're striving for.
Yeah, we all make fun of the commercials that were like the sad animals in cages,
Oh my
or
gosh.
for pennies a day or a cup of coffee a day. But that was,
Sad.
yeah,
Sarah
that
McLachlan.
was like deficit based, where we were framing and looking
Yeah.
at, oh, these poor kids or these poor animals, help them out of it, pity, versus really thinking
Yeah.
about our missions are much more complex and robust than that. And what we're
Yeah.
doing is much more impactful than that too.
It's a lot of, I think that's been endemic in the sector.
Yeah,
It's
absolutely.
baked into the have and have nots. It's baked into the, oh, I'm going to use my dominant position to help over
Right,
here.
right.
That
Right.
we look around and define things that we can do that
Right.
way versus
It's like pennies for the poor. I don't want pennies for the poor. I want to end poverty.
exactly.
Like,
Yeah,
That's exactly right.
Exactly.
So Frank, once folks can see that they're utilizing deficit framed language and they move into this idea of asset based language, can you talk about the move to transformative language?
It's interesting because I love this question. And as I was reading it, I wanted to start or lead with by saying asset-based language is transformative. And to me, then it becomes consistent. The more that you use it, and again, I know we'll talk about it in a sec, when we can help not just donors, but any person who might be a stakeholder for the mission of a nonprofit, see things in a way that is not transactional, that is absolutely like, this is your community, this is our community. that's where the transformation happens. So it begins with asset-based language. And really, as I said, to me, those are interchangeable. Asset-based language is transformative. And then it's all those other added pieces. You can talk about, overhead differently. Don't call it overhead, call it core mission support. You can talk about all these other pieces that helps donors really see the impact of being involved in certainly those languages. It's literally what I've said before, just disrupting those brain patterns that we're used to and that we've been socially conditioned to hear certain things, break out of those patterns and find a different result.
I almost feel like the transformation is the result. I like how you framed it, the consistency, just that continuing to show up, continuing to put the assets forward. And then what comes of that and your practice of that becomes contagious and transformation.
Yeah. And something that your donors walk away also framing differently. If the stories that we tell that like stick, that people think about, that they walk away thinking about, if those stories are based in asset-based language, they'll tell the story differently. So you create a different sort of ripple effect when you're centering your stories.
This is big. This is good. I love that we're talking about this. We're going to take a quick break and then we'll be back talking about language and why it matters.
Unleash the power of events to energize your donors and amplify your mission. Join us at the Elevate Conference in 2025, where you'll learn the essential tools for planning a successful fundraising event. Book your tickets now for March 12th and 13th. This dynamic hybrid conference, hosted at Avenue in Portland, Oregon, and streamed live for our virtual audience, will equip you with practical tools, demos, and templates that you can put to work immediately. Don't miss out. Secure your spot today at Elevate 2025. Visit elevatenonprofit.com to register now. Elevate Conference 2025 is brought to you by Swaim Strategies and the AV Department, powered by elevatenonprofit.com.
Welcome back. We are here talking about the power of language. Frank, I'm wondering if you can talk about what resistance to asset-based language looks like.
Yeah, I mean, it's new. And usually when I have these conversations with fundraisers, I'll state at the beginning that, look, this is new information. All I ask is that you process it. And if you've got additional questions as we're going through it, let's go through it. And I will still have some people in that space feel a little resistant. And I'll give you an example where somebody said, well, what if this asset-based approach just becomes another trope of just, they didn't use the word manipulation, but basically saying, it felt like in the statement that they weren't fully buying into using asset-based language. I didn't respond to him or them. I don't know if it was a him or a her. I didn't respond to them because we were still moving through the chat box. It came up quickly, then left, but I saw it in the survey feedback form. What I would have liked to have said to that person was, well, in the absence of a different approach, what would you do? If these are my only two choices, I'm going to go with the asset-based approach because I know it's much more community-centered. I know it's much more uplifting to the communities that we serve. And if somebody ends up using it in a manipulative way, I can't control that. All I know is that this is a way that it's a starting point. We need to have a starting point and how it moves through. And as Sam said earlier, the evolution of language happens anyway. What I'm saying today that is asset-based may not be in 5 to 10 years. And we just continue to evolve. So I wish I would have been able to say that to that person in real time, is like, in the absence of anything else, I would highly recommend using this approach because of how it chooses, or it starts to disrupt those brain patterns on how we talk about communities. And it absolutely stops the process of perpetuating harmful stereotypes.
Yeah. Well, I think part of this work, whenever, like, there's a number of areas you've touched on, Frank. You've touched on ethical storytelling and the importance of consent. You've touched on the power of storytelling and the language we use. And you touched on community-centric fundraising versus donor-centered fundraising. And I think whenever we dive into work that is intended to evolve, to move the sector forward, we have to look at progress, not perfection, right? Like we have to be willing to explore and ask and learn in order to see change and impact grow. And there will be times that maybe what we say isn't what we hope the impact will be, or maybe we have an unintended impact. But I think that that's so much of what you're doing. Your work is so centered on helping people to feel like they can start to move into the conversations and start to be having these conversations and try things that maybe
Right.
aren't, what they've always done before. So I'm a little just curious for folks. Can you talk a little bit about your work specifically with For the Hood and how that work is helping sort of create some transformations, or at least get people on that path of moving toward progress?
Oh, absolutely. I think as we were, I'm going to start it in a place that doesn't sound like it's connected to what you asked, but it's getting there. So the Ethical Nonprofit Summit, that just completed last week, as we were preparing, and I was one of the organizers of it, as we were thinking about, all right, well, we have VIP packages. What might you offer, Frank, as a VIP, thing? And I thought a language audit. I said, so
Mm.
simply just bring me your end of year appeal, maybe one from the past. Let's look at let's look through it together. And that's a really great starting point from a fundraiser standpoint of like, here's what I've written before. Can you just look at it and tell me where the gaps are, or where the deficit frame language appears? It's beautiful because I've already gotten more than a few of just wanting to start that process. And one beautifully said, I'm ashamed to say that I said, you're going to see a lot of deficit frame language in my year-end appeal. And I'm like, well, it's a starting point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then for organizations, I think very similar. I think a language audit in regards to what their processes and policies look like. Uh, Flexible scheduling, that's to me is an equitable process. If you're somebody who, as I didn't mention this, but generational wealth gaps between white folks and people of color, it's 10 times more than Black folks, and it's 8 times more than brown folks. That alone says there's some inequity. So how can an organization step up is look through some creative ways to make equitable changes in your policies. And to me,
Yeah.
flexible scheduling is a big one. Working remote is a big one. If it's not needed to be in the office X amount of time, really look at those opportunities to be creative on helping your employees be in a space that they feel that they can stay in and be loyal to.
I think the pandemic taught us and evolved a lot in the way of folks' willingness to use technology to help close gaps. And I want to go back to something you just said about you're an organizer for the Ethical Nonprofit Summit. And although it has passed, is that something that people can still, there was a lot of great content that day and you had a ton of amazing speakers. Is that something people can still access, or is there a way to get involved in future summits?
Yes, this is the first of its kind. So, to your first part of
Yay.
this question, I don't believe that they can access now because you had to
Okay.
purchase it ahead of time. The recordings are good for up to 3 months. This was in September 19th-ish. So October, November, maybe till December 19th. But I can ask the organizer for sure, the creator of the conference for sure. But it's not the last of its kind. We're already
Great.
starting to plan for 2025. Well, we had about 300 turnout. And more than a few said it was amazing simply because it was all focused on those things you said: ethical storytelling, community-centered practices, and things like that.
Well, it's an important discussion. So we'll make sure to link folks in the show notes to understand how they can access the summit, because it was completely virtual. So it was accessible to everyone to be able to
Mm-hmm.
participate, and regardless of where you were. So we'll want to
Mhm.
pull that forward as a resource for folks.
Great.
So often we talk about transaction working against relationship building
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
staying immersed in transactions being sort of not helpful in cultivating relationship. And so I'm curious about, when we think about deficit framed language, how that can actually inadvertently restrict money. Can you talk about how transactions and transaction focused language impedes actually building
Oh,
relationships?
absolutely. And mind you, this is probably one of the biggest pushbacks that I get, because we hear it all the time. For $50, we can get this. For a hundred
Right.
bucks, you can get this. So right off the bat, it sounds like a transaction. Oh, well, if I do $200, and then you'll get double the 100 thing. And what it's inadvertently doing is it's not connecting the donor to the organization and its vision and its mission. So I often advocate for leading with the mission and the vision. And think about food insecurity. You can say, hey, we're a food bank and we give food. We can feed 50 for $500. We can feed 50 seniors. Blah 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 blah. Whereas you can still say the elements of that, but saying, our vision is to eliminate food insecurity. We want to make sure that there's food for everybody, and your $500 can help us towards that vision. It's a much different way of framing it versus a transactional point, and then using in the vision. And you can even combine those elements. You can still say, your $500 is going to feed 50 older adults in our community and really help us make a move toward eliminating food insecurity in our community. So again, there's ways to do it, but if it's strictly just for $50, for $100, for $1,000, that's where we're inadvertently restricting the gifts, because then they might only give the gifts in a programmatic way versus in an unrestricted way. When you're giving gifts towards the vision, you're basically telling the organization, here's the money, use it any way you want. And as we know, in the nonprofit world, we need those unrestricted dollars to do the work.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. They're so hard to come by. And it happens in event fundraising all the time. That paddle raise moment is the moment where all of a sudden you went from this like compelling, impactful narrative that you've been building through your event about the work you do, the impact you have, the mission, the client you serve, the transformation that the client had. And if you've done it well and ethically, they've told their own story, please. But when you move through people through this journey and then immediately move them into transaction, when you start saying for your $10,000 you can, for your $5,000 you can, and you restrict your giving, and like the event fundraising is so often the one opportunity people have for unrestricted giving, to say we need this money to keep the lights on, but that's not super sexy. So people end up attaching, you can send one kid through the program, or you can feed one family, and then restrict not only their giving, but also then lose that opportunity for those important funds that are needed for all the other things.
But also, I would argue, beyond like literally locking up the funds to have to be dedicated to that thing, you're restricting your donor's ability for their personal mission to be bigger.
Right. Yeah.
Like there's the literal restriction that's happening, but then there's actually this restricted moment where you're not allowing your donor to come into the asset space with you and really transform. That you're teaching them, no, I'm going to ask you when we need this thing, or I'm going to ask you for this specific amount, and this is how you're going to measure impact. And so we get really cranky with donors when they're like, why don't they understand we need to keep the lights on? It's like, well, because you haven't set them up to do it. You haven't set them up that's important and that they can be transformational in that way.
Right. And I would even add it a step further, not just individual donors. Think about foundations that give, and they say, your expenses, your overhead expenses need to be between 10 and 15%. That's literally impossible to do the great work that needs to be done. And so changing that narrative, shifting that language, how we say things, saying to the foundation, look, I'm applying for this, but I'm going to tell you how unrealistic this is. Any little opportunity that we can shift that narrative, and we need to do. And I'll say this one last thing. In my community in Tucson, we've got about 3 or 4 foundations that have adopted trust-based philanthropy and have moved really away from these restricted gifts and are giving more and more unrestricted gifts. It's really, and again, that's even part of the deficit framed approach versus an asset-based approach. It's trusting the community that they know how to use the dollars. They've never had access to those dollars because of systemic differences or disparities. Trust that they know what to do in regards to moving the needle, because right now it's not working. It just isn't. Well, so we need to come up with new strategies.
That funding model, though, from the foundation world has restricted us for so long that not only has it limited what's possible in impact, like it has literally restricted our missions, because we can't hire the professionals that can actually impact the issues that we're trying to resolve. And I think that moving into more of a like reframe, positive frame, how are we actually going to manifest the visions that we have and the work that we do now is something that, to your point, should be showing up in lots of different places, not just showing up in a conversation with a donor or a grant that you're writing. How do you see language changing when you think about like approaching a sponsorship solicitation or the like different audiences you're talking to? How is this change impacting those audiences?
I think similarly what we just said, I think a lot of in terms of sponsorships, it's painting a new picture, creating a new narrative to those sponsors of the larger impact and what the need is. The transparency, I think helps as well. It's just, and I see this even I have a day job and it'll remain unnamed, but it's a 501c6 nonprofit, but they still seek dollars and sponsors just as you asked. And often I can see, and I'm not the person that's seeking them, I can often see that dynamic of like saying what they feel that the sponsor wants to hear
Yeah.
versus the larger conversation of like, look, this is what we need and here's where we're struggling and this is your community. So again, to me, it's just using that asset-based and creating a sense of belonging, which is what I say in my session when we went in a couple of next week.
Yeah.
That I'll be talking about that. Creating a sense of belonging with the sponsor, I think will go a long way and should go a long way. Will it be 100% successful? Probably not. It's a shift. But I think we need to start taking those steps in that direction in order to secure sponsors that I would even say, kind of to Kristen's point, at a higher level than they've given before because they have a fuller picture of what the needs are.
It's funny. I would actually say that not all corporations, but many corporations actually are already doing this work because they're looking at asset-based language for employee retention. They're looking at how they reframe their narrative for consumer retention. And I think we're actually behind in the nonprofit sector. So I actually have seen that when you speak from the strengths and the benefits and the impact of the work, it actually moves the sponsor along with you further faster. I have seen that in event programming as well, like your event script and moving an audience. That sense of belonging is so important right now. We're seeing that is a huge motivator for why people support and give, is that sense of bigger connection, bigger impact, collective action, being a part of something outside of myself. So I think that while it may feel foreign to some, it's overdue in other areas, and it might allow the nonprofit sector to catch up a little bit.
Agreed.
Frank, I'm wondering too, I'm thinking about the impact of deficit framed language for trajectories of nonprofits, thinking about, what is that vision forward when we're fulfilling on a part of our mission? And that if we're constantly defining people by the deficit, then what do we do after that, right? Like, let's say our mission was X to fix X deficit, and we've done it. Do we cease to exist? Like, I feel like it's baked into limitations as organizations, that if we're coming from a place of not only asset, but transformation, that we actually could expand our mission in a really compelling way to envision a different future. Not only we're getting rid of this deficit, but we're collaborating.
We're building
we're co-collaborating with all these other people to build this transformational world or community or neighborhood. Do you see folks in organizations, when they make some of these shifts, start to actually think about the potential of their work differently?
I would say yes and no.
Yeah, totally.
What I would say, and thank you for framing that, Kristen, what I would add to what you said, it's overwhelming, the issues
Yeah.
that are happening in our communities. And I would say over the course of my last 6 years, 3 years leading that organization, 7 years. So 3 years leading a nonprofit, and then 4 years at this organization that's business focused. What I've recognized is the power of policy. So what I would love to see going forward is finding the right partners, public, private, nonprofit, CGOs, all of those coming together to create policies that can make actual movement, because I feel like a lot of our nonprofits are doing great work in silos.
Yeah.
And again, I'll speak from my experience in Tucson. When I led that nonprofit, it focused on workforce development. Poverty in Tucson has persisted at around 20% for the last 25 years. The organization that I led, we were seeing 90% graduation rates, 89% job attainment rates, 40,000 plus salary increases.
Wow.
But poverty still persists
Yep.
in my
Yeah.
community. And so to me, we have to look at it differently. And so in addition to what you said about these successes, we can't look at it from an individual standpoint, because then if that were the case, and then the place I was at rocks,
Yeah.
yet the community still suffers, and it's not making the impact. And so any opportunities, what I've learned in the last 7 years is collective impact. We need to find the right partners to create policies that can be embedded and really help our communities, so that we're not at 20% for the next 25 years. So that would be my only addition, is that's what
Yeah.
I'm saying, is that I want to see more collective work, partnerships, private and public. We need everybody involved to make the changes we need to make.
Frank's like, transformative language, transformative gifts. No, I want to transform the whole sector.
That's right.
It is where the work, I mean, we have in our community seen an impact from that kind of collective action.
Yep.
Where we have a lot of strong policies that are creating protections in our state that don't exist in some states. And I feel very lucky, because I feel like we have some safety and resource in our state that is because there has been a mix of elected officials, business leaders, nonprofit leaders, multiple different causes rallying together in alignment with funding and grant funding organizations to create a policy agenda that has then created some protections. So I agree. I think that like we can't keep sort of just plugging the hole or putting the Band-Aid on, right? And so often some of our missions are just that like temporary, we're getting you through the day. But how do we, not just feed someone, but how do we teach them how to fish? How do we, solve the bigger systemic issues? And to me, that is in transformative work, transformative collaborations, transformative language. So I think that this is a door to walk through in order to start to do that bigger picture work.
Yep. You have to believe it's possible first.
Yeah.
Right. And that's, to me, what I hear some of this doing for organizations in sort of shifting perspectives is folks believing that that asset is possible.
Yeah.
Versus continually being identified or identifying by deficit. It's
Yeah.
a shift. It's a paradigm shift in a lot of ways.
I actually think we have a really salient, relevant way to frame this too, in that if you look in the media and the election, you can see, for example, one campaign is leading deficit based and one campaign is leading asset based.
Absolutely.
And you can see the impact of the asset base is creating a movement, right? And it is creating an energy and pulling in voters, people, individuals that haven't been or haven't felt like politics were for them.
Right.
And that sense of creating and co-creating something bigger, I think, is really powerful. It certainly is appealing to me from that sense of, I want to dream beyond this. I don't just want to fix the problems. I want to dream of a different, better future, not just the Band-Aid solution. So I think it's a really very present example of how those language choices make a difference.
Sure. Through the ads, absolutely. You
Yeah.
can see one is completely deficit framed and the other one is asset based.
Well, and I think they definitely speak to those who want to take collective action, those who want to be a part of, move into the asset based. And if we're building missions, we want people moving into the work we're doing.
That's true.
Well,
true.
we're going to take a short promotional break, and when we come back, we're going to ask Frank to step into the fundraising elevator with us. So we'll be right back.
Are you ready to engage supporters and grow your base with your own podcast? Then let us introduce you to our partners at the AV department in Portland, Oregon. In addition to delivering exceptional live event audiovisual production and videography, they also have a top-tier production studio and an expert team ready to take your content ideas to the next level. Contact the AV department to schedule a consultation and start bringing your podcast vision to life.
Well, welcome back, Frank. Let's jump into the fundraising elevator where we're all headed up. We ask all of our guests for one tip, one recommendation for our frontline fundraisers about what they can do to head up. So if you were to give a little sage piece of advice or wisdom, what would you suggest?
Well, I can sum it up in 3 words and then I'll explain. But it's do no harm. It's really important that I think one way you can do no harm is if you're writing a story about a client in a deficit framed way, imagine you're that client and would you want to be described in those ways? And if you feel the ick, then and shift to slick. So that's what I would recommend. Do no harm.
From ick to slick.
I love it.
It's a t-shirt.
So if folks want to learn more, we're going to put a link to your introductory guide in using asset-based language in the show notes. If folks want to get a hold of you, if people want you to help take a look at some of their stuff and point out, kind of cast a little bit of light on where they can focus attention, how should they do that?
Oh, so yeah, codaforthehood.com. It's the number 4 DAHOOD.com. And that's the quickest and most immediate way to get a hold of me. You'll see all the offerings, but certainly, yeah, if you want a starting point, I think this is a way to go. And I feel it's relatively inexpensive for like an hour, consultation. Bring some of your documents that you've written in the past, and we'll look at it together and see how you can improve and go forward. Plus, you'll get access to a bunch of these documents as you just mentioned with the introductory guide to asset-based language.
Amazing.
I love it. We will put a link to your site also in the show notes. Okay. And we super appreciate your time today.
Oh, thanks for having me.
You will be able to catch Frank, Sam, and myself at the Nonprofit Storytelling Conference next week. The conference this year is in New Mexico, and we're super excited to explore storytelling more with you, Frank.
Come say hi if you're there.
Say hi if you're there.
For sure.
And friends out there listening, please join us next week when we talk to Joe Davis of On Point Community Credit Union all about event sponsorship from the sponsor's perspective. Get the inside track and be sure to tune in.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
The Fundraising Elevator is produced in partnership with Swaim Strategies at the studios of the AV department. The program is produced and directed by Steve Osborne, with audio engineering and original music by Dwayne Anderson, Heidi Christensen, and Adam Breeden. Video production by Shannon Doran. Graphic design by Pendulum Creative Group. Marketing by Lisa Aragon. Support from Mary Elizabeth, Todd Campbell, John Lyles, and Andy Dowsett. And voiceover by Josh Boykin.
Friends, before we leave you, we want to ask for your help to make the podcast grow. If you enjoyed what you heard today, please follow, subscribe to the Fundraising Elevator. And if you're getting a lot out of the show, please share it with a friend and leave a review. These things help make sure that the podcast continues heading up. Thank you so much for tuning in.
Ready to take your fundraising to the next level? Need to get unstuck in your event planning? Now's your chance to connect directly with the experts behind the Fundraising Elevator. Book a one-on-one consulting session with Sam for strategic planning and fundraising strategy, with Kristen for your program and storytelling, or Mary for your registration and data tools. They're here to provide you personalized answers to all your event questions. Don't wait. Raise more at your next fundraising event. Book your session today at elevatenonprofit.com. You can also find the link in the show notes. event planners are discovering Avenue, the Pacific Northwest's new AV-forward event venue, intentionally designed with nonprofit fundraising events in mind. From the 93-foot video production wall to the highest quality sound and lighting, premier AV features are included in every venue rental. You'll find the space and audiovisual enhancements to create your unique and memorable event. Visit avenueportland.com to schedule your personal tour.